The text that I chose to do my presentation on is called Coming Out of the Shadows and Undocuqueer. I chose to look into this topic because the word shadow stood out to me as one that had deeper meaning. Think to yourselves, has there ever been a word or a phrase that has been used to dehumanize you or a group in which you were a part of? Was there a stigma attached to it, and did it affect how people interacted with you? How did it make you feel? These questions lead me into what this text is about. In Coming Out of the Shadows and Undocuqueer, author Hinda Saif analyzes the intersectionality of sexuality and immigration status through the use of language. Saif focuses her research on undocumented youth residing in Chicago and Illinois as a whole. Chicago's Immigrant Youth Justice League demonstrates the use of language to band queer and undocumented youth movements together as a means of achieving political and social change. There are three major ideas that this text investigates. First is an analysis of the similarities and differences of coming out as undocumented and coming out as queer. Second is how the term coming out of the shadows is a reworking of the two terms coming out and shadows to marry two movements. Lastly is how the use of the term undocuqueer is used to embrace one's identity as not either undocumented or queer, but as a combination of the two. I'll start with the similarities between the queer and undocumented experience in the U.S. In the text, Goffman defines a stigma as an undesired difference around which ideologies are built to explain someone's inferiority and account for the danger they represent, essentially justifying discrimination. Stigma is something that impacts both immigrants and the LGBTQIA+ community. Anti-gay insults and anti-immigration rhetoric are similar in that they both seek to dehumanize people. The stigmas that undocumented women are hyperfertile, undocumented men are hypersexual, and queer people carry disease are all broad generalizations that essentially compare human beings to animals. This places immigrants and queer people alike in positions of fear.
I refuse to think of what another 10 years of not knowing if I will be able to come home to my mother and brother will feel like. I refuse to think of what another 10 years of dreams shut down will feel like. Dreams of a good education, dreams of a normal life without fear. I am undocumented. I am not afraid. I will not hide any longer. I will come out of the shadows every day if I have to. I'm a human being. I deserve to be happy.
What do you think of when you hear the phrase coming out? If you're like me, you probably associate the term with coming out of the closet and with the LGBTQIA+ community. To understand how Chicago's Immigrant Youth Justice League seeks to apply this idea of coming out to their experience of coming out as undocumented immigrants, we must first understand how coming out as queer is different than the experience of coming out as undocumented. Coming out as queer can occur at any age and presents its own set of struggles. The judgment that queer youth can encounter from religious institutions, family, and friends can be a challenge like no other. Coming out of the closet is a practice that typically occurs within the private sphere. Undocumented youth face a different, less personal struggle. Undocumented children raised in the U.S. have blended in with their U.S.-born peers, following the same trends and learning the same language. Only when they become older and are in need of things such as a driver's license and subsidized college loans do they have to come out as undocumented.
I remember when I was young, they always told me, don't tell anyone about your status, because that could be taken away. I remember being scared every time they told me. But I didn't really understand what it meant to be undocumented until I got to high school. I began to feel ashamed, frustrated that I couldn't do the same things my friends could. Get a license, I couldn't vote, I couldn't study abroad. All these experiences growing up almost led me to give up on my dreams and my education. But one day, my mother reminded me that they brought me here for a better life. They brought me here so I could be somebody. After hearing that, I knew I couldn't give up. My name is David. I'm undocumented. I'm not a criminal, and I'm not afraid.
Undocumented youth reside in the shadows as a way of protecting themselves and their families from the U.S. government and judgment from U.S. society as a whole. Chicago's Immigrant Youth Justice League reworked the two terms coming out and shadows to marry the two movements. This term became coming out of the shadows and is the origin of a large social movement to own your status, whether it be as undocumented, queer, or both.
My name is Rigo, and I'm undocumented.
My name is Reina, and I'm undocumented and queer.
And my name is Tanya, and I'm also undocumented and queer.
The three people you just heard proclaim their statuses as undocumented and queer are the founders of the Immigrant Youth Justice League in Chicago. They organized groups of undocumented youth at their college to embrace their undocumented status and reclaim the word undocumented that had been used in the past as a way of dehumanizing them. Shouted out gatherings were one of the ways in which they did this. At these gatherings, they would shout out, "Undocumented and unafraid," as a way of unlearning the fear and stigma that they had internalized about their legal status.
Undocumented, unafraid. Undocumented, unafraid.
In 2010, this manifested itself into Coming Out of the Shadows Week. Groups of undocumented and queer youth rallied in Chicago, New York City, and Los Angeles to proclaim their statuses of being queer and/or undocumented. Seif argues that using the term coming out as a part of the undocumented youth movement wasn't to appropriate LGBTQIA+ experiences and history, but to highlight the intersectional experiences that both LGBTQIA+ youth and undocumented youth share. Language was the key way in which they did this. This brings me to a discussion of the term undocuqueer. Seif conducted interviews with undocumented queer youth, and many explained having to choose when to be undocumented and when to be queer. The term undocuqueer came about as a way for undocumented queer youth to reclaim their identity as being both undocumented and queer at the same time. This gave them a sense of community and allowed them to be unafraid in taking up space in the political and social spheres. This reclaiming of one's identity creates opportunity for organization and change to occur, change that is necessary for the well-being of all undocumented and queer people residing in the United States.
Coming out means telling a friend, a loved one, a classmate, a teacher, something that otherwise you would have kept private. It is using our lives and stories as a political tool for change. I am done.
There are many things that stand out to me about this reading and how we can learn from the examples set forth by the Immigrant Youth Justice League. The first is the importance of educating ourselves on movements and experiences that are not our own. If this generation of undocumented youth had not been exposed to the histories, languages, and experiences of the LGBTQIA+ community, they wouldn't have been aware of how they had reclaimed homophobic terms and turned them into something positive. Second is our role in breaking down stigmas and stereotypes in our everyday conversations. Language and discourse hold such a prominent place in society, and if we allow racist, anti-immigration, or homophobic slurs and microaggressions to continue, we're allowing these systems of oppression to keep working against a freer society for everyone. Discourse can change the course of history. The time is now to make a change, and it starts with us. Lastly, is that we must begin to see movements as intersectional instead of isolated. Systems of oppression are working to keep the oppressed silent. Whether it's a movement about women's rights, voting rights, LGBTQIA+ rights, black rights, or immigration rights, we're all working against the same systems of oppression. We must recognize this and join together if we want change. The Immigrant Youth Justice League of Chicago is a wonderful example of all of this and more. I want to leave you with a question. Are there other ways in which you have noticed language playing a role in politics and society? Are you taking an active role in challenging systems of oppression? Why or why not?